interpreting from Portuguese into English and vice versa. So that's why I'm speaking in Portuguese. And we are going to ask our members of the panel to speak in the language in which they feel much more comfortable. We have the chat box where you can present the issues, question, just write down your question. The facilitators and the whole text
se confirma porque a situação de instabilidade neste momento no distrito de Cabo. Mas conosco a senhora Sara Love para as suas palavras de enquadramento. Qual vai ter
Clear and loud.
Obrigada. Obrigada. Há echo para mim. É possível mute. Muito obrigada. Sua Excelência, Diretor Nacional de Política de Defesa, Coronel de Infantaria Omasaranga, Excelentíssimo Presidente da Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos em Moçambique, Luís Pitona Nair, Senhor Chefe da Divisão de Negócios e Segurança do DCAF, Alan Bryden, Senhor Diretor de Ética e Resiliência de Chatham House, Alex Vines, Senhor Diretor Adjunto do Secretariado dos Princípios Voluntários de Segurança e Direitos Humanos, Cabo Charos, Senhor Diretor Executivo do Centro para a Democracia e Desenvolvimento, Adriana Nevunga, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Sinto-me honrada e privilegiada por poder participar deste webinar na companhia de todos vocês e das ilustres presenças aqui no painel. Este é o terceiro e último webinar no âmbito deste projeto e é subordinado ao tema Princípios Voluntários, Negócios, Segurança e Direitos Humanos em Cabo Delgado, lições aprendidas, benefícios e oportunidades traçando caminhos para atividades relevantes neste exercício. Mensal que como governo do Reino Unido é parceiro deste projeto que tem como propósito minimizar o risco de abusos dos direitos participação efetiva
we
e
want
que
to highlight the effective participation should bring effective results if we build a moderate consensus, and this should be the role of each one of the stakeholders in this tripartite relationship, the government, civil society, and the business sector, which is often seen as controversial. The fact that we mentioned that this is the last webinar in the project does not mean the end of the dialogue on business security and human rights in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado in particular. As was mentioned by the governor of Cabo Delgado, we will continue to mobilize organizations, cooperation partners, and population at large so that they can can get involved in actions that aim to promote the exercise of human rights. This shows that there is a lot to be done in relation to the theme and the commitment of all stakeholders here present. The set of webinars and workshops conducted were a space of dialogue of the topic and came up with recommendations on the way forward to promote and implement in an effective way the
foram de muito aprendizado.
Me põe aí a falar. Não, tem que pôr o vídeo e a minha câmera. Muito obrigado, Sara, Love, por estas palavras e por destacar a forma como o governo da República de Moçambique se apropriou desta iniciativa e daquilo que nós vimos nos workshops, daquilo que vimos no diálogo bilateral e também multilateral, ficou claro para nós, tanto ao nível dos stakeholders daqui de Maputo, como os stakeholders na província de Cabo Delgado, a vontade de utilizar esta plataforma e utilizar os princípios voluntários como ferramenta para abordar um problema local. Então, nos sentimos bastante encorajados pelo feedback que nós temos e também pelas palavras da Sara Love, no sentido de se dar continuidade a todo este momentum que se gerou e a expectativa que se gerou para a utilização desta plataforma como um espaço para abordar localmente o problema de Cabo Delgado. Muito obrigado. Convido agora o Dr. Luís Bitone, o presidente da Comissão Nacional dos Direitos Humanos, a proferir as suas palavras, que esteve conosco ao longo de todo este processo. Dr. Luís Bitone.
Gostaria, antes de mais nada, felicitar aqui a presença muito notória do governo de Moçambique, e concretamente o Ministério da Defesa, que foi em vários momentos representados ao mais alto nível, através do próprio ministro, e hoje estará o diretor nacional da Política de Defesa, que é uma pessoa também sênior no Ministério, porque entendemos de que esta ação sem o Ministério não terá o significado. E também felicitar aqui o CDD por estar empenhado nesta tarefa que não é fácil, de mobilização de recursos, de pessoas, de consensos, e esperamos que continue assim, e nós como comissão só temos que felicitar e apoiar esta iniciativa do Centro para a Democracia e Desenvolvimento. Não gostaria também de deixar este primeiro momento de felicitar o British Council, que em todos os momentos está representado ao mais alto nível. Isso mostra de que está comprometido em termos financeiros e também em termos de
terms and technical support to this very important initiative. To the guests that are here with us today, I would like to congratulate you And our expectation that you will be able to share experiences and practical know-how and share with our participants so that the voluntary principles initiative can be a reality in our country. We witnessing the end of a series of meetings first held in Maputo, then in Cabo Delgado, and again in Maputo. This has been an approach of general
Situação nacional e avaliar também
national situation and the national awareness on the voluntary principles on business security and human rights. We are sure that the voluntary principles are known to the major stakeholders. We are talking about civil society, human rights institutions, the government, and in particularly the Ministry of the Defense, the provincial government. We want to see this process emerging, taking place there. We are all allied in the sense that there are conditions to move on. I would also like to specifically mention the representatives of Cabo Delgado province. In this process, we saw the dynamism, the commitment of the top leaders of the Cabo Delgado province, starting from the governor of the province, the state secretary of the province, who participated and shared ideas, insights on this process. And it was visible that we all agree that with the fact that this initiative is going to promote human rights. I would also like to highlight a very important aspect in this regard, the methodological approach of these events. In the past, we witnessed civil society doing initiatives, individualized initiatives, isolated initiatives, the government as well, and continuing isolated, individualized initiatives. This event is very important because it constitutes an innovation in its participatory and inclusive methodology. We see now, side by side, government institutions, human rights institutions, civil society at large, participating in a single initiative and talking in a single voice. I think that this approach, this methodological approach should be encouraged because in the past, it was only criticism from one side to the other. And now we work towards a common cause, which is the defense of human rights in our country. As National Human Rights Commission, we are going to carry on supporting the initiative. We are going to participate actively. We are part of this process from the beginning, and we are going to contribute with our inputs, ideas, experience on this matter. It is true that we don't have much to say on voluntary principles yet, but we are willing to do everything we can so that our contribution in this regard becomes relevant. I would like to stop by appealing to a process of what we call action plan. It's very important that we draft guidelines, an action plan on what we need to do, what we are going to do. We are witnesses of very important initiatives, some of which have been omitted because we don't have an action plan, a more detailed timeline on what we are going to do, whom we should count with, and what should be the role and responsibility of each one of us. I would like to appeal to the government, the CDD, the National Human Rights Commission, and other relevant institutions so that these initiatives should be about sharing responsibilities and solidarity between the parts. I would like to recall that we are living this period of this pandemic, the COVID-19, a delicate period for human rights. It constrains the enjoyment of fundamental rights for Mozambican citizens. However, on behalf of public health, it's important that we respect the measures that emanate, that are taken by the competent authorities. I appeal all Mozambicans to respect these measures because they are going to save lives. Thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you a very productive afternoon. Mm, Thank you very much, President of the National Commission on Human Rights, Mr. Bitone, for the encouragement, for the challenge, and for what you highlight, the need to have a plan to move on with this initiative, this important initiative. We fully agree with you, and we are going to work in that direction. I'm going to invite the Colonel Mukamis, a representative of the Minister of National Defense. You have the floor. Good afternoon, Excellencies. Once again, we are together. Apologies. We are together in this platform to continue following the workshops that were held in Maputo in Cabo Delgado, focused on the voluntary principles on business, security, and human rights in Mozambique. I would like to highlight that these were days of lessons learned, exchange of experiences among the participants. We are referring, for example, referring to the Cabo Delgado province. There were permanent secretaries of the districts in the province. We had the presence of the governor, the state secretary, and other stakeholders at provincial level who shared their lessons. Regarding the lessons learned, the benefits and opportunities drafting the way forward, I have to say the following. For the Ministry of National Defense, to talk about lessons learned, benefits and opportunities within the scope of the voluntary principles on business, security, and human rights in Mozambique means the culmination of a phase aimed at building a vision on promoting the highest values of human coexistence. In fact, the Ministry of National Defense recognizes that the debates, in spite of introducing new analytical concepts, reveal important aspects that concern the triangle on development, conflicts, and security and human rights. And the line is not that good. We highlight the importance of intra and inter-community relationships, the involvement of the governmental authorities, intervention at various levels with the civil society, and the relationship civilians and the army. We should also highlight as another lesson, the involvement of all stakeholders considered as relevant by the CDD in order to establish a harmonious environment for all of us, because all of us understood that security is a collective need that requires the sharing of responsibilities. The Ministry of National Defense through this platform try to highlight the recognition and the relevance that gives to the promotion and preservation of the voluntary principles on security and human rights in the Republic of Mozambique in such a way that from our interventions we reiterate the need and the obligation to work in compliance with the enforced legislation. For the Ministry of National Defense, the participation in this series of debates constitutes an opportunity to consolidate its communication with the various layers and segments of society, national and international. It was an opportunity to show its institutional framework, and we try to present as assumptions the elements that guide its activities. We also mentioned that the commitment of the National Defense Forces in the protection of development projects, similarly to those taking place in Cabo Delgado, are part of the responsibility of the institution. The natural resources in the soil and underground are a property of the Mozambican state. The National Defense Forces in Mozambique, within the scope of its missions, intervenes whenever the legitimacy of the state, the institutions, and observance of human rights are threatened or put at risk. In addition, we mentioned that in spite of the complexity of the operational missions, the armed forces have to conform with internal law and international humanitarian law within the scope of the international humanitarian law. We need to observe, respect all that is enshrined. And we also share that the President of the Republic, as the number one or the top senior staff of the defense, national defenses, has been instructing the members of the armed forces in the sense of respecting human dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ministry of National Defense has expectations regarding the success of this initiative, so that it is effective and in contributing to the establishment of a multi-sector platform within the scope of the voluntary principles, security, and human rights, and it surely enables to reinforce the dialogue between the civil society and the government. The ministry, the communities, and all those affected, and a dialogue with all other relevant stakeholders. And we sincerely hope that from now on, we can involve the voluntary principles as a module, as a component in the training of the armed forces. We reiterate our gratitude to the CDD, its partners, for the invitation, and we hope that this initiative will attain the results for which it was established. Thank you very much.
Muitíssimo obrigado, Coronel Carlos Mukamisa.
Thank you very much, Colonel Carlos Mukamisa, for your speech on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. I invite Dr. Alex Vines from Chatham House. He conducted a very important work about the possibilities for Mozambique to embrace these voluntary principles. Dr. Alex Vines is going to conduct his presentation. I'm honored to invite him to share with us his slides regarding the presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Adriano Mavunga. I also want to thank Dr. Luis Bertoni, the President of the National Commission of Human Rights in Mozambique, for his very illustrative and important presentation. I'd like also to compliment Colonel Makamisa of the Ministry of Defense of Mozambique for his remarks and insights. That they both show how important this CDD platform for dialogue is in partnership with the government agencies that are relevant. And finally, I would like to thank Sarah Love and the British High Commission for their support of this process. I think you can see that it's a good use of British taxpayer money to assist Mozambique in this regard. I am going to show a few slides, so I'm just about to share my screen. Okay. So my name is Alex Vines, and as Adriano introduced me, I'm the director, managing director for Risk, Ethics and Resilience at Chatham House, which is an independent policy institute in London. What I'm going to talk about is how business and human rights and security and Mozambique's experience of them has in fact been central to even the birth of the Voluntary Security Principles and the Voluntary Security Principles Initiative. I myself had the privilege of working and living in Mozambique in the 80s, and I was the Africa Watch, or as it is now, the Human Rights Watch researcher in Mozambique during the end of the civil war that ended in 1992. And so my reflection in this presentation is about how some of that experience of Mozambique during its civil war fed into the thinking for the creation and birth of the Voluntary Security Principles in 2000. And that was because people like myself had had experience working with business and seeing the challenges for private security and state security. So although we are now talking about this issue again in Mozambique, in this very important initiative led by CDD, the roots of this go right back into the 90s. And there's a Mozambican taste and insight to it all the way through, as well as Angola. So just to say that Chatham House works a lot on Mozambique. We've had all presidents of Frelimo except Samora Machel speaking at the Institute. We've had leaders of the opposition also, including my condolences to Mozambique on the death of Davi Simango. We had him at Chatham House. That's all available on our website. Now, this is more for an international audience than a Mozambican one, but Mozambique is vast. So flying from Afungi to Maputo is like going from New York to Houston or Paris to Moscow. So the scale is enormous. And within that, many different things are happening and very many different challenges that are important for security and observing human rights. And one of the things that Mozambique has had much experience since independence in 1975 is episodes of armed conflict. And within that, in all of these different episodes, businesses have had to try and operate. And that is where I think some of the learning for business and human rights, in fact, has come about. I myself know that in the late 80s, early 90s, because I've written about it and interviewed and seen it, there were private security companies that were brought in to help us to protect commercial assets. Think of, for example, Tiny Roland and Lomaco, for example, and the operations up in the tea estates of Gurui, or in the Chokwe Valley, for example, and tomato plantations there that needed private security against the then armed attacks of Renamo rebels. And those security arrangements were considering at that time what was the best practice of that time in terms of human rights. So where were the boundaries of security? What were the responsibilities? And how to work with government state forces? So none of these questions are new. And there was and transfer of experience from Mozambique to elsewhere. So as I said, it's history now, but that history is relevant for the Mozambican context today. And some things have improved. So this is just a reminder, the Renamo conflict is over in Mozambique, as everybody knows. There is obviously the splinter group of the Junta Militaire, but you have a process of the final ending of the Renamo armed contestation, I think, and this is a reminder of the progress that's being made. So of the DDR, even in a COVID situation. So some conflicts finish and others increase. And so here we see this slide showing that obviously the very serious situation which we're talking about today in Cabo Delgado, but the problems of central Mozambique were elsewhere. So the voluntary security principles and the voluntary security principles initiative isn't just relevant for Cabo Delgado. It is relevant for the whole of Mozambique, from Rovuma to Maputo, from Tet to the Indian Ocean. And within that, there are different industries that are and businesses that will benefit from it. So obviously in Cabo Delgado, it is mining, particularly gem fields, but also oil and gas, so Exxon, Eni, and Total. But you've also got the coal mining industries of Tet, and you've got other mining operations in the center of the country in Manica Sofala. And as I reminded you in the history, with the experience of Tiny Rowland and Lomaco, in terms of their experience of trying to provide security in a complicated security environment for tea and tomato production, Mozambique's future is still going to be a lot about agriculture. And so the voluntary security principles will also be relevant related to commercial extraction and production of agriculture, which will be a future mainstay of the Mozambican economy, whatever happens to the gas story in the future. And so these are principles that, working with the government of Mozambique agencies, are relevant for the whole of Mozambique and for many different industries, not just the mining ones that we talk about very, very often. And of course, there are international links, and the Cabo Delgado one throws up more complexity. This is not a lecture or a discussion on this, but it is a reminder that what happens in northern Mozambique is internationalizing. And we had the United States just a few weeks ago describing the insurgency in Mozambique as a foreign terrorist organization. So the best practice of the voluntary security principles, I think, is very relevant in countries that experience these things. There is an in-country process in Nigeria that is very relevant to Mozambique. We have heard of an informal process, and Alan might talk about it again, in Eastern Congo. But there is, the point I'm making is that these links of international radicalization and security responses in these difficult situations can be accommodated by something like the voluntary principles. There's good learning from Nigeria, from Colombia, from Indonesia that can be helpful for companies that are dealing in a contested situation in Mozambique, like in Cabo Delgado, but in more stable situations too, which is the majority of Mozambique. It would be very wrong to think of Mozambique as a conflict-ridden country. Much of Mozambique is peaceful, but the voluntary security principles are as relevant there as they are in Cabo Delgado. So the Mozambican government has been active on initiatives of business and human rights for some years. So from my perspective, bodies on security and human rights were created in 2000, but we should also consider the UN's endorsement of the guiding principles on business and human rights proposed by the UN Special Representative for Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, the Ruggie principles. Both actually should be considered at the same time. This seminar is about the voluntary principles on security and human rights, but actually the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are also equally relevant. And as you can see, a number of senior government officials and ministers have spoken about these things. The big step forward for Mozambique was last year in August 2020, when the government of Mozambique signed its Memorandum of Understanding with Total, which commits the government of Mozambique to ensure that the Joint Task Force of Personnel for Security in Afungi and its environment around it act according to the voluntary principles of security and human rights. We have also heard today in the opening remarks by Colonel Makamisa about how training on the voluntary security principles will become more standardized within the Mozambican security and defense forces. This is a very positive step forward. It's an important development, and international partners, organizations like CDD and others will be as supportive as they can to the Mozambican government in this. This is also echoed, obviously, by the president himself, His Excellency President Philip Nyusi, in February this year, when he was talking about the importance of human rights in his presentation to the government of to the African Union. So again, I think we see important building blocks here in terms of building up and developing a interface between business and human rights in Mozambique. So why am I talking about this? Well, one is that my time at Human Rights Watch, I was there for the birth of the Voluntary Principles and the Voluntary Principles Initiative, and was there including at the very beginning of the drafting of texts with Bennett Freeman, who was a US official, and others, and the United Kingdom government was an early government involved in this also, as well as the US government. And I've followed the process since, and was very involved in VPI in its early years, including sitting in the stakeholder meetings, comparing notes, and working out of how companies can implement the VPIs, the voluntary principles, in difficult circumstances, be it in Casanare in Colombia or operating in Equatorial Guinea with strange security arrangements. And so my conclusion from that period has always been that these are useful standards to have in a toolkit with dealing with challenging security environments. Chatham House is conducting a piece of research at the moment, which is about preparing for a report on what is the relevance of the voluntary principles for Mozambique today. So where is the best practice, where is the learning, and what are the pathways forward? I see this piece of report as a bridge between the excellent workshops that CDD has done through webinars to an in-country process that can help partner with the Mozambican government, but civil society and private sector in cultivating a deeper culture for business and human rights in Mozambique. This slide summarizes the work that we're doing, which includes a literature review. And what we have also been doing is consulting the companies that are involved in Mozambique that are already voluntary principle initiative signatory companies. So they are companies, some of them have left Mozambique, like Anglo-American and Rio Tinto. Others are still there, although some are declining, BP, but Eni, ExxonMobil, Shell, Gemfields, Total, and so on. And so there's plenty of learning in this. And the reality is that it's not just the experience I referred to in the 90s that was relevant for Mozambique's development of this. These big companies have been implementing the voluntary principles, even though there is not an in-country initiative and Mozambique itself is not signed up to VPI yet. Over the years, as Dr. Louise Bitone has referred to, there has been advances on discussions on voluntary principles in Mozambique, and then regression. So there have been ebbs and flows. What I think makes this initiative and why CDD should be congratulated is that what this initiative that we are talking about today is different, is that this is built with a partnership between government and civil society first, rather than through the private sector. This is, I don't know, I'll listen to Alan and other speakers, but this makes the Mozambican initiative currently different from some of the other initiatives that I've seen that have been very private sector driven. I see that from talking to the private sector companies, the big companies that are involved in Mozambique at the moment, like Exxon or Total or Gemfields, that there is tremendous appetite to kind of partner with the Mozambican government and civil society. And so I think there is a great opportunity here that is developing in Mozambique. Wouldn't it be marvelous if Mozambique joined Ghana to be a voluntary principle initiative signatory? There is good learning from Ghana, good learning from Nigeria, and also good learning from some of the internal, the informal processes that are taking place in Africa that could be very helpful for Mozambique, as well as Mozambique's own deep historical experiences of this, both from today and from the past. And finally, I just want to say obrigado and thank you for listening to me. I again congratulate CDD on its important initiative, and particularly what occurred in the workshop in Pemba, I think was incredibly important about bringing this conversation beyond Maputo up into Pemba and Cabo Delgado. Adriano, thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for everybody also. Thank you.
Obrigado, Dr. Alex Vines.
Thank you, Dr. Alex Vines. It was clear from your presentation that Mozambique can learn from Nigeria. Mozambique can learn from Indonesia, and it can also learn from Colombia. There are very important experiences from those countries. So it's very important to see how the government, the civil society, and the private sector can be organized in order to guarantee that the human rights are observed, respected. I want to highlight the fact that the communities have the right to see their communities developing. That is the right. They have to participate. There is a need of transparency in all the processes. When it comes to the revenue, it's very important to guarantee that all the process should be transparent, especially looking to the nature of the country. So all those aspects should be taken into account. And we thank you. We thank you a lot for this opportunity and for the experience that you have shared with us. I want now to invite Dr. Bryden Allen from Geneva Center of Governance. Dr. Allen, please take the floor. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here among you and on this distinguished panel today. I can only take off from where Alex left us and say that, you know, I am convinced that there are significant learnings from voluntary principles implementation experience in other contexts that can help to support Mozambique going forward on this path. But indeed, the path is a Mozambican one. And I think listening to the speakers that have gone before from the Ministry of National Defense, the President of the National Human Rights Commission, and the professor and CDD itself, you know, we see that there is that buy-in from the different stakeholders, which is absolutely critical, as is the support, the sensitive and attuned support from international partners. And I can only, you know, acknowledge the great support of the British High Commission for that. It's a great pleasure to be here. DCAF's an international foundation that supports good governance of the security sector. We work with international partners, but fundamentally we work with national processes and stakeholders to reinforce security sector governance in ways that contribute to security development and respect for human rights. Now, of course, if you want to deliver on those objectives, you need to engage with all actors that can make a meaningful contribution. Thus, it's absolutely key that the private sector, that the business community has a meaningful role in these processes, and all too often that isn't the case. It's for that reason that the voluntary principles, the multi-stakeholder approach of the voluntary principles on security and human rights is so powerful, because it convenes government, civil society, and the private sector in relation to the extractives in a way that these actors can work together. It's therefore an initiative that we've supported for over a decade, and we're very committed to continuing to support. We have a long-term partnership with the International Committee of the Red Cross to promote good practices in relation to voluntary principles implementation. But fundamentally, we're as DCAF an operational actor, and we're strongly committed to supporting locally driven implementation processes, locally driven working groups that can drive the voluntary principles on the ground. In that respect, we've supported the creation of 3 new working groups. Alex alluded to 2 of them in the DRC, also one in Peru. And we also support a range of other live voluntary principles working groups. So in my presentation, I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to give some concrete examples from the experience of the DRC, which illustrate some of the outcomes that an effective working group can realize. And then afterwards, I'd like to take a step back and reflect on some of the building blocks and lessons from that experience that may be relevant for the process in Mozambique going forward. So in terms of examples, first of all, in relation to the Eastern DRC, DCAF supported over the last 2 years the creation of a new multi-stakeholder working group in South Kivu, which really brings together companies, civil society, local government, community actors, and the security sector to try and proactively address, from a prevention-based logic, some of the very real security challenges on the ground there. Now, a key thing that the group does is monitoring, is active monitoring with companies and communities of security situations. One example where that came into effect related to intercommunal tensions and violence around mining, where 2 cooperatives occupying the same space had severe disagreements, which led to violence over how that mining concession would be used. They both engaged informal and illicit security providers to kind of defend their territory, and the situation became very difficult and tense. And there, the working group conducted a very rapid risk assessment of the situation, the stakeholders involved, mediated between the 2 cooperatives, and as a result, forged a joint security agreement, which permitted a kind of cohabitation and defused the tension. It also kickstarted a process to withdraw the illegal armed groups from that particular region. Now, in a separate incident, again driven by the monitoring that this local group conducted around extractives operations, a number of incidents arose around inappropriate use of force by local police who were assigned to the concessions. It resulted in injuries to community members, arrests, and also violence against protesters who were complaining about the mining company in question. There again, the working group investigated, provided detailed reporting of the incidents to local authorities and provincial authorities, raised awareness with the mining police on human rights obligations, and also, and I think this is the fundamental point, was able to be an honest broker that could bring together the company, the security force representatives, and the community to discuss the issues and try and chart a different path forward. And this resulted in a number of follow-ups. One is that the local commander responsible for some of the management of the incidents and some of the police were relocated and moved away. And the second, and I think the most durable thing, was a new security agreement between the company, the local community, and the mining police, which included space for peaceful protest and other issues. So this really was with a view to the future. A second example I'd like to give relates to voluntary principles training, which has also been mentioned by a number of speakers so far. In particular, human rights training for public security forces. And there, as part of this support process in the DRC, we supported a training for the public security forces assigned to the extractives operations. And the key thing is that this was developed really with a lead role for the working group, and that brought in the commander of the mining police, community actors, the local authorities, and in the context of the DRC, the United Nations, the UNPOL. And this co-creation model of training, I think, is absolutely key. First of all, it meant that training on issues around use of force, the voluntary principles, human rights, were directly linked to local and national realities and also to national law. They didn't come from outside and just a sort of set of general principles. Secondly, it enabled, through the buy-in from the different parties, a commitment to a train-the-trainer approach as a follow-on. Because in the end, the last thing you need is a load of one-off trainings. You need to build sustainable national capacities to deliver those. And finally, and this is very much an ongoing story, discussions are ongoing at the national level to integrate the voluntary principles training into the national police curriculum, which again provides a means of sustainability and ensuring that it becomes embedded. Now, another area that Alex very rightly brought up in his presentation relates to private security. And in the DRC, as in many contexts, private security is an opaque industry. There are significant questions around vetting, around training, and national regulation is weak. So there, as part of the work in relation to the voluntary principles, DCAF teamed up with another important international initiative in this space, the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers, to develop tools to support civil society information collection, monitoring, and reporting. And this has been rolled out in 10 different provinces, actually, of the DRC, and rolled out in a way that civil society actors, the provincial ministers, the regulators responsible for private security, and the companies themselves were all involved. Because I think, again, this is the key strength of the voluntary principles, that each stakeholder has to see an interest in it. And that monitoring and that analysis is also leading to further reflections nationally and provincially on the kind of regulation that's needed, on the kind of oversight among these different groups. The final example I'd like to give is at a different level. It relates to the importance of political engagement. And I think what the voluntary principles can contribute on that level. And again, as an example from the DRC, in 2019, Switzerland had the chair of the Voluntary Principles Initiative. And as chair, a high-level delegation visited the DRC. The delegation engaged in the provinces with the local groups and identified priorities, but they also had a high-level engagement with the government, with the ministers of human rights and of mines. And this resulted in a commitment from the government to join the Voluntary Principles Initiative. Now, this is an ongoing story, but I think this is a very significant additional layer, because that political engagement, on the one hand, has led to greater communication and understanding between the capital-based process and what's happening in the provinces, more information exchange. And secondly, because voluntary principles membership requirements require the development of a national plan, a national action plan, and a mapping. This has the potential to bring much greater clarity to the different initiatives, including but far beyond the voluntary principles that are going on. And one would hope for greater coherence between them in the future. So those are the examples I wanted to offer, and briefly on the lessons that I think are relevant from them for the process in Mozambique. I think the first thing is that relationship and trust building is absolutely key, particularly in the early stages of a new process. And I'm conscious that, you know, one way to look at what's been the process that's been led by CDD is, well, this looks like a lot of meetings or a lot of webinars as it is these days. But it's absolutely fundamental that the national and local authorities, the community representatives, the security forces, and the companies are all on the same page about what is to be achieved. And that is the basis that will enable some of the very practical interventions that I described. I think another thing that I would highlight is the need for the right kind of support and capacities to empower such a working group. And in South Kivu, in the example I gave, the partnership between DCAF and the group was on very practical issues, like the development of risk assessments or incident reporting, things that could enable the group to, or indeed on use of force, minimum standards and good practices, things that would enable the group to engage in a meaningful and credible way with partners. A third point I would make is I think the success of groups at the local level is very much reinforced, and the chances are optimized through the linkage to international initiatives. And it's clear that the voluntary principles provides a red thread and a set of guidance and good practices and political engagement that can really push forward the process. I would also highlight the International Code of Conduct and the Montreux document, which focuses on state responsibilities and good practices in relation to oversight of private security. And a final point, the group I mentioned in South Kivu wasn't a freestanding voluntary principles group. It was established within an existing structure that had been developed in coordination with the OECD to support implementation in the DRC of the OECD's due diligence guidelines for minerals. And by doing that, all of the political capital was already engaged. There was already strong commitment from the Minister of Mines of the province, and buy-in. And what people recognized was that what the voluntary principles brings is a specific focus on security. So I very much align with the points that were made that the work to drive the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and other initiatives, this has to be seen as a whole, and we need to get the synergies there. Now, my final point is about donor coherence. I think, again, the work in DRC, actually, it started with a 2-year contribution from Netherlands, but very quickly, the UK, Switzerland, and Norway joined. And this enabled the development of a multi-year process which you could build a programmatic approach and not have one-off activities. And I think that kind of coherence and joint planning is absolutely critical. So having made those points, I think I would leave it by saying that I very much acknowledge the challenges and the particular challenges of the context of Cabo Delgado, but I also see a very strong basis of multi-stakeholder engagement. I think that is absolutely key and really speaks to the promise that this initiative can offer. So let me leave it there just by reiterating the full support and commitment of DCAF to this process. So thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Alan Bryden, pela perspectiva.
Thank you very much, Alan Bryden, by the perspective that you bring. Thank you for the issue or the focus that you make on the building of trust and the focus that you make on the issue of dialogue and the need to bring everyone to this platform, the need for capacity building as well. One of the important things that we show in Cabo Delgado, for instance, is that people need to build capacities in order to build the trust so as to participate in these processes. For us, these seem to be a lot. And obviously, the need to have a more inclusive space where all stakeholders are able to understand and feel that they must participate. The experience shared from the DRC is very important. We are very pleased for being with DCAF in this important initiative of building trust, establishing the conditions so that we can move on to a more inclusive dialogue. I would now like to invite Jonathan Dreamer from the Voluntary Principle Initiative to present the perspective on what should be the way forward, taking into paying attention to the presentation made, because this is the moment in which this issue was brought with a major emphasis. There were previous experiences and the need to bring this perspective. Jonathan Dreamer, please tell us, after these 3 months of commitment, 3 months of participation at all levels, global, regional, national, and provincial, in Cabo Delgado, where we were, what do you see? What do you see emerging from all these process?
Thank you.
Jonathan Dreamer?
Thank you, Adriano, and thank you for having me, Alex, Sarah, Colonel Alan, of course, who we've collaborated for many years within the Voluntary Principles Initiative. So thank you for your remarks as well. I have two primary suggestions, Adriano, coming out of presentations that we've heard, and I will start by mentioning them and I'll come back to them at the end. And the first is I do think having a local implementation working group, either under the auspices of Voluntary Principles Initiative or with the participation of the initiative, is an important next step, and I'll talk a little bit about that and what that is. I also would strongly encourage the government of Mozambique to consider application for membership in the Voluntary Principles Initiative. And so let me talk about a little bit about the Voluntary Principles Initiative on both of those areas, and then come back to those at the end. So as you heard, the Voluntary Principles Initiative was created about 20 years ago by home government, particularly the US and the UK, to help address challenges that multinational companies were having in their overseas operations. And the principles largely set standards of good practice that are designed to help not only companies, but also governments, home governments and host governments in overseeing and driving good practice and through engagement, as well as civil society, academics, and other stakeholders who are affected by company operations and the interface with public and private security. The principles, in short, give governments confidence that companies, as well as public and private security, are engaging in a responsible way. Currently, the roster of home governments has expanded. It now is the United States, as well as the UK, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland. And for these home governments, there are several benefits that they see. One is that the voluntary principles are almost regulatory. They are quasi-regulatory. They identify the step that companies should be taking with a degree of accountability. There are verification frameworks and peer learning sessions to identify good practice by, and they have the participation of companies, of civil society, and of home and host governments, as well as our observers, our esteemed observers, who I shouldn't ignore. They include organizationally specific key performance initiatives, annual reporting on activities for all three of the pillars, as well as ad hoc engagement with companies, with host governments when incidents do occur. They provide a visibility into the security and human rights arrangements for extractive companies, as well as their interactions with public and private security, and assist in larger policy efforts, anti-terrorist efforts, by increasing national stability and addressing security-related risks. So for home governments, they are important for transparency, visibility, and the support of foreign policy objectives. And on that basis, what you see, and to transition into the role that home governments can play with host governments, they often will engage very directly, as we see here in this discussion, home governments engaging with host governments through embassies, through national ministries, through high commissions. So there is a high level of interface and engagement. They assist in capacity building, in providing assistance, helping to share lessons learned around transparent security arrangements, participating in local working groups in host countries. And so you do see an important level of engagement between home countries and host companies around the Voluntary Principles Initiative and in connection with the voluntary principles themselves. And sometimes I have seen it myself. Home governments will step in and provide advice to all local actors in challenging situations, in situations where there may be tension, One example, several years ago in Peru, there was a road blockade associated with a mine. The government pillar, the United States, engaged with the government of Peru, engaged on a security-to-security basis, and talked about effective ways potentially to address the protest, and it ended peacefully and without incident. And that level of visibility, that level of support and sharing of best practice ended up preventing potentially human rights violations from occurring. So that level of engagement and capacity building can be very helpful for home and for host governments. But to transition and focus more on host governments, there are several that are currently members of the VPI. Argentina, Colombia, Ghana are three, for instance. But the real extensive engagement that occurs whether it's a government as a member, a host government as a member of the VPI or not. And I've seen incredible changes in terms of the level of engagement and the depth of engagement and the quality of engagement between the VPI and host governments in the last 15 years that I have played any role, been involved in the voluntary principles. And I'm sure Anton would say the same, and Alan, as you heard from Alex as well in his presentation. Among the key things that I have witnessed, and these are just examples, implementing good practices through the framework of voluntary principles capacity building. This would include vetting, the screening and background checks that are done, the due diligence that is done on potential public security members to ensure that individuals without risk of human rights abuses are included within the public security forces. One of the most significant areas has been around training, and including not only advanced and in-depth human rights training with public security forces, but also new techniques and advances in terms of effective security training. We've seen this with NGOs, voluntary principles NGOs, providing training specifically to public security forces, police and military personnel. We've seen the ICRC, which has been involved with the voluntary principles since its inception, also provide that kind of in-depth training. We've seen NGOs, civil society, and some of our observers serve as effective liaisons between the community, public security, and companies, an important role that helps serve as a sounding board as well as providing strong advice. We also have an enormous catalog of tools that host governments are using and quite frankly helping to advance and improve. These might include training programs that the VPI has put into place. It might include for instance, regarding vulnerable populations, a children's rights checklist and guidance that was created several years ago with UNICEF and UNICEF Canada that focuses on security and human rights for both companies and for public security providers. It has model contract, MOU provisions to help create transparency with governments and companies to avoid allegations of corruption, to ensure an effective understanding of roles and responsibilities. It also would include accountability and investigation, and supporting the institution of the rule of law and assistance from home governments regarding dilemmas that might be associated with incidents or concerns that ultimately arise. But perhaps the most significant set of changes that I have seen, and we've seen those alluded to, have to do with the local implementation working groups, which have been a center of in-depth and detailed and sophisticated engagement over the past several years. The implementation working groups effectively are structured dialogues on a periodic but repeated basis that include local community members, local and international civil society, home government, host government, companies, other affected parties. There's a gathering to talk about, security arrangements, concerns, approaches, issues that have arisen. It helps to create a confidence among community members. It helps to create confidence in the international community about good practices being understood and being followed. It helps to create a shared learning and experience between actors on the security side, whether it's companies on the private security side or government and public security side, in addressing challenges and dilemmas. It helps reduce tensions that might otherwise exist, which sometimes can lead to human rights violations. And quite frankly, it can help alert communities to potential challenges and physical risks that ultimately might be coming down the pike. And for governments, you might learn about additional risks that might exist that the community ultimately can transmit. So just as one example, in 2017 in Ghana, after a military and police joint task force was created by the president to address challenges associated with illegal mining activities. Originally, this task force didn't have human rights training. There were tensions that were inherent, that were part of that situation, where there was a concern about potential human rights violations coming from the inevitable conflict between the illegal miners and between this task force. And so the local Voluntary Principles Implementation Working Group recommended specific training on the VPs for the operation officers. The Canadian government, one of the home governments, partnered with the Ghana Armed Forces and others to support the training. Something like 425 people were trained by a leading Voluntary Principles NGO, a VPI NGO, as well as a local NGO in partnership, and the Army, a joint training between the Army of Ghana as well as a VPI NGO and a local NGO. This training was then integrated into all future training for the military, and it has gone on to reduce conflicts and related risks over the long term. It's a good example of how the local implementation working groups can lead to shared dialogue and meaningful and sustainable change. We've seen similar stories in Peru in terms of sharing good practice among actors on the ground with international and civil society, embassies, VPs companies, non-VPI companies, the Peruvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, other government representatives, developing a sound foundation to address security and human rights concerns, and ultimately to have engagement with the government of Peru, which is not a VPI member, but still engagement with the VPI around these sound practices. So the last point I will make on this is that in addition to reducing human rights risks and increasing transparency and increasing stability, increasing confidence, increasing engagement, it increases confidence for international investment. Joining the VPI, implementing the VPs, it absolutely increases confidence in international investment. And some home government export credit agencies specifically look at membership in the VPs or implementation of the VPs in considering their overseas investment decisions. Senior companies increasingly are concerned about operating in difficult locations, rule of law and safety issues, those kinds of things. Implementing the VPs has been a strategy that we have seen employed by several countries, host countries, as they seek to increase their international investment profile. Colombia is a perfect example, as it emerged from a history of conflict, particularly arising from the Shining Path. It became, as part of an overall strategy to attract international investment and demonstrate stability in the rule of law, it became a formal member of the Voluntary Principles Initiative. It's been an active participant following those years of security related concerns. And ultimately, we've had in-depth engagements in country. And the feedback that we've received is that by joining the VPI, the Colombian government has become more accustomed to analyzing, discussing, and addressing human rights issues in the context of their everyday business operations. The perception of conflict has decreased, the perception of stability has increased, and international investment ultimately has fallen. So in the end, I would come back to where I started, which is number one, an implementation working group under the auspices of the Voluntary Principles Initiative or with the participation of the initiative can help drive stability, it can help create transparency, it can create confidence, and it ultimately is useful from an economic development standpoint. In addition and beyond that, certainly would encourage the government of Mozambique to consider an application for membership in the Voluntary Principles Initiative, where the greatest level of engagement and in-depth participation and learning ultimately can be had, but certainly look forward to further engagement with the government around challenging security and human rights issues that may be occurring on the ground, and which obviously through webinars like these, seminars like these, the roundtable series, we can tell that it's serious and addressing. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Jonathan Drima.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Drima. I wouldn't agree less with you regarding the importance, strategic importance of voluntary principles. Today, when the Ministry of Defense talked about present the press relief on the security situation in Palma, we can see an evolution in the narrative. It includes now the issue of respect for the humanitarian international law. They highlight the need to respect human rights. And if we compare with the previous press releases, we see here an evolution in the way the defense and security forces are operating or reporting, particularly when it comes to the rule of law and the way when it comes to the respect for humanitarian and humanitarian law, and this raises the level of responsibility and the perception that people have regarding the respect for human rights, not only to improve the business environment, but also as a tool to deal with the problem in Cabo Delgado. The issue of human rights does not concern only the arbitrarities, but it concerns the right for development that the communities have, the issue of participation, the issue of transparency, and the way the various elites position themselves when it comes to the natural resources, including the relationship between the central provincial levels concerning the management of these resources. I wouldn't agree less with you. We are going to continue, and now I'm going to invite Anton Poluch, our advisor based in Europe, to make initial comments before we give the floor to the participants for questions, comments, and answers, and wrapping up. Anton, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adriano. In the interest of time, I'll keep it very short. As you said, we have to face the issues, the real issues that make a difference on people's lives and make a difference on human rights on the ground. And that's only possible if we're successful in building the process of dialogue. And dialogue requires trust. So I'd like to thank all of you who have, over these last 3 months, backed us, trusted us, joined us in this process. And I think we have managed to, over the last 3 months, create a process that is credible, authentic, and reliable. I think are 3 elements that are important in the trust equation. And I would also say your personal commitment, Adriano, and that of your team, and that of the host government will help to manage the perception of interest or otherwise in this initiative. It is with that combination of managing self-interest, reinforcing the authenticity, the credibility, and reliability of this process that we are now in a position to affirm it as a platform and give it some relative stability for the months to come, including, as Alan has invited, as Alex has pointed, as John has indicated, through membership of the host government. But that is not the only thing. It is, of course, the commitment of the multi-stakeholder nature of it. And as Alex has said, yes, we have designed this not to be dependent on the benevolence of business, but having only the wish of business to be part of this process, like any other stakeholder, because there is an equality of stakeholders at the end of the day in terms of trust. So I'd like to thank you, Adriano, and I stop there, and I look forward to continuing this process in the months to come. Thank you.
Muitas perguntas e respostas. Pergunta. Muito obrigado, Anton.
Thank you, Mr. Dr. Anton, to highlight the fact that there is a need of the authenticity, reliability, the genuinity character of this initiative. This is what we aimed at right at the beginning when we started with these initiatives. So this process engages all the stakeholders, but we should create a conducive environment where we have transparency, collaboration, so that we can have the dialogue between different people who are directly involved in this process. And we should have a pragmatic discussion of all the issues related to Cabo Delgado. I would believe more, but it's very important to highlight that all your comments, all the comments that had been shared here are very important so that we can achieve the objective that we have. And we rely entirely on your contribution so that we can achieve our objective. I will invite Usufu Adam. He's a senior lecturer at Eduardo Mondlane University from the History Department. He has been conducting different studies about Cabo Delgado, about the northern part of Mozambique. Many of his studies are related to what is happening in Cabo Delgado. He shows a kind of a perspective of different dynamics that are happening here in Cabo Delgado. Therefore, he's trying to show the social, economical side of the impact of everything that is happening in Cabo Delgado. And he also highlights the fact that there is a need to hear the different contributions that may be important in order to find a decision or a conclusion in order to solve the problems it leads to minimize. And also he highlights the participation of the women, the participation of different organizations that are led by women in this process. So what is your experience regarding the participation of women, the participation of organizations which are led by women in conflicts, in situations similar to what is happening in Cabo Delgado? I will invite Mr. Allen to answer some of the questions and to comment on other speakers' contributions. And then I will invite Anton, and I will also invite Sarah and other participants to give some comments on all the contributions and that had been shared here. And over to you, Mr. Allen.
Thank you very much, Adriano. And I think what I'd like to do is the questions in relation to gender and diversity, let me link them to, I think, a wider value add of the voluntary principles and the community of the voluntary principles, which I think Jonathan spoke very well to, which is the need to share and learn lessons. The first thing I would say is the working group model and approach is an opportunity and a mechanism to mainstream diversity and address issues around, shall we say, agency and the lack of a voice for certain communities and certain parts of communities. And I see very powerfully in all the working groups that we engage with that the role and the place of women and sort of gendered security challenges features very prominently, and the groups are used as a way to go beyond some of the blockages that one often sees. And I'll give a very practical example of what that means. Late last week, we were part of an exchange between working groups on the voluntary principles in the DRC with their colleagues in Colombia, who also work in very different but very challenging environments on security and human rights challenges. And that was an exceptionally rich and practical exchange between two sets of actors on the problems they face and the strategies that they develop to address them. And they focused on gendered security challenges around mining areas, around other areas. They focused on the security risks that they face on a day-to-day basis, and tactics and strategies for dealing with armed groups, which is something common. So I would just say that this community around the voluntary principles isn't just focused on the national level, but on the very practical sharing of experience on concrete issues like that one. I would also say, because I deliberately spoke to diversity and not just to gender, but another part of the decisions catalyzed through these working groups focuses on children's rights and children's vulnerabilities, which is also, I think, a key part of, you know, any meaningful way to address the vulnerabilities that people face. So I think that's the first point. I'd say maybe the second point is tools and processes already exist. And those tools and processes, if they're right, are not meant to be blueprints or cookie cutters, but are meant to capacitate and enable local stakeholders and processes to figure out their own solution. In relation to companies, and I think, you know, guidance for companies, you know, I would highlight the DCAF ICRC toolkit on addressing security and human rights challenges, which speaks to a number of these very specific issues. But there are also important tools out there in relation to private security and in relation to private security and gender, for example. And I'd be very happy to make sure that those are available to everyone in the process through CDD and through their website and whatever other means, because I think often the challenge is putting things in people's hands and helping them to be used. So I think those are the points I would make in relation to those specific questions. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Alan, por estas.
Thank you, Alan, for your comments. Thank you for the very illustrative examples. Those are very good initiatives to approach this kind of issue, the issue of gender, especially in the industry sector. So how the human rights issue is benefiting from the different initiatives related to the human rights. The experience that you bring, the experience from different countries such as Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo. So all those experiences are very important.
Thank you very much for that. I think we plan to try and build as much as possible a broad coalition here. Voluntary principles, security and human rights, as Alex rightly pointed out, are only one aspect of the business and human rights relationship. And likewise with the broader human rights obligations of a nation towards its citizens. So for example, with regards to the question about gender participation, I would say the broader answer would be that of a broader participation of young women and women in the democratic process of Mozambique. That is what will eventually hold accountable the civilian authorities and indeed all that happens in the country. So as Chatham House really pointed out, this is not simply something that is related to one industry or one part of the country. Agriculture was mentioned. This is a broader industrial conversation. This is a broader livelihoods conversation. So we plan to establish a platform whereby good practice can be circulated elsewhere in the country and avoid bad practices from being circulated. When things are sometimes ignored, bad practices tend to percolate elsewhere. We'd like to at least be a force in a very modest way that stops that kind of behavior. So Adriano, I pass this on to you. In the interest of time, people have been extremely patient listening to this, and we will have many more opportunities in future to go deeper. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Anton, por estas considerações.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony, for your comments. We'll continue with the session. So today is the last session of a series of webinars, but beforehand, I would like to say that during the 3 weeks, we had very hard work, but that work, those events enable us to build a trustworthy base. It helped us build an honest base and also enable us to bring different stakeholders in this process. And we want to take one step forward to the second phase. So this webinar that we organized today is to discuss the learning lessons and also discuss the steps forward in order to draft the path to draft the framework of the human rights that can be taken into consideration, looking at the extremism that is in place in Cabo Delgado and different parts of Mozambique. I will invite Sarah Love from the Higher Commission of the British High Commission to comment on the contributions that we had.
Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, chegado a este momento em que já
we have reached this stage. We had the 2 workshops, and this is the 3rd webinar. I would like to say that that we are very delighted. We worked very hard during these 3 months. It was very, very good to have all the stakeholders involved, and then they show interest in contributing in this project. We had an involvement of international partners to support these initiatives. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our specialist, Alex, that in the next weeks will share the briefing notes, and then we'll have a report that highlights the paradigms, the assumptions, and the reports, and also include the different experiences from different countries in the application of the voluntary principles. To conclude, I would like to once again thank for the opportunity that I was given to talk about this initiative. And I also want to thank you all for your time. I mentioned in different occasions that the voluntary principles are very, very important because they deal with the protection of
primordial, que é produzir mais lucro sem interrupções no processo produtivo de
rights. That's important, that should be taken into account. We know that most of the companies, most of the enterprises are worried in generating profit, but it's very important to look at the voluntary principles when we look at business, when we look at the human rights. But it's also very important to think of the roles of different stakeholders in this process. And I just want to thank you all, especially our colleagues that have been working very hard in this regard. Thank you very much for your comments. So your comments will help us see the steps forward to see what's going to happen in the near future. I want to invite Coronel Camisa for his last remarks. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies. I'm honored to interact with all of you. You have contributed with your comments. You shared experiences from different countries. You explain how the human rights in a certain context should take into account the voluntary principles. It was good for us, and we are honored to have very important specialists sharing with us all those experiences. Just to say that some of the approaches that you shared are new to us. It was something new to us, but very important aspect that was highlighted when one of the participants said that the voluntary principles should be regarded in a global manner. The Ministry of Defense has been always open to contribute, to participate during the 3 months. We participated in the 2 workshops, and we are here once again to reiterate that we are open to contribute, to participate actively in these initiatives. Our armed forces are in the front line to guarantee peace and security, but the human rights should be also taken into consideration when we look at the community. We hope that CDD will take steps forward if there are some action plans which include capacity building. I just want to highlight that we are open to participate and to give our contribution. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Colonel Carlos Mukamis, for your comments. I just want to thank you, to thank all of you, starting from the government, the Ministry of National Defense, the provincial government of Cabo Delgado, the governor Luigi Tayabo, Professor Armando Ngunga. Our partnership is evolving in order to restructure this platform, which is we hope that the outcome of this partnership can be a strong platform that will enable, will create channels so that different stakeholders can have dialogue, can communicate. I would like to thank the High Commissioner for the partnership and support and encouragement. I would like to thank Mr. Alex. I'd like to thank the High Commissioner to take part in these meetings. You have been always with us, and I just want also to thank all the team and also our partners, DCAF. I also want to thank the Voluntary Principal Secretariat, especially Mr. Anton Bonut, and CDD team that helped us in order to organize all the work that we had during the past 3 months. And I just want also to thank the interpreters, Sarita Erickson, that has been always with us, assisting us. And I would just want also to thank the Mozambicans that have always shown opportunities for us to interact with them. We'll be back pretty soon with the various initiatives, especially in Cabo Delgado, in these districts. This initiative was not planned or organized for Hutu, but this initiative was organized for Cabo Delgado, for the northern part of Mozambique. We are all together. The struggle continues. Thank you.